Welcome to the Michigan Department of Education's Teaching Comprehensive History webinar series. I am Jen Saylor, Assistant Director of the Office of Educational Supports. The Michigan Department of Education encourages teachers to lean into teaching the rich and diverse history of our country and world. The presentation you will see today intends to provide educators additional perspectives, knowing that as educators expand their knowledge, they will be better able to create lessons that help students meaningfully engage with history. We are proud to work with institutions of higher education, cultural centers, and the Confederation of Michigan Tribal Education Departments as they bring their research and expertise directly to Michigan educators. Today, we are fortunate to welcome Dr. Jason Young back as our presenter for part 2 of a 3-part series. Dr. Young is an Associate Professor of History at the University of Michigan. The presentation you will experience today explores the crucial relationships between art and history and African American life and culture, as well as political and social ideas such as race, slavery, and freedom.
Thank you, Dr. Saylor. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. My name is Scott Koenig, and I am a social studies consultant with the Michigan Department of Education. We are thrilled to have all of you in attendance as we continue the Comprehensive History webinar series. Your interpreter for today is Jennifer Atherton. The TCH webinars are intended to lift the knowledge of educators so that in turn you may provide opportunities for students to inquire, think critically, and explore history from multiple perspectives you may have not heard before. As you listen today, you are invited to explore these opportunities to take new learning, insights, and ideas to your communities. Dr. Jason R. Young teaches and researches in the fields of 19th-century United States history, African American history, and African Diaspora. Dr. Young is the author of Rituals Resistance, African Atlantic Religion in Kongo and the Lowcountry region of Georgia and South Carolina in the Era of Slavery, and co-editor with Edward J. Blum of the Souls of W.E.B. Du Bois, New Essays and Reflections. He is also the co-curator of Hear Me Now, The Black Potters of Old Edgefield, South Carolina, which will be on view at the High Museum in Atlanta through May 2024. Dr. Young has published articles in the Journal of African American History, the Journal of Africana Religions, and the Journal of Southern Religion, among others. He is currently conducting research toward his next book project, To Make the Slave Anew, Art, History, and the Politics of Authenticity. Welcome, Dr. Young.
Thank you so much for having me. We're really happy to be here. Thanks so much. I'm really excited about continuing the conversation that we had from the first time, and in many ways, this is a continuation of the conversation that we had. Although if this is your first time joining, you haven't missed anything. You're not behind at all. I will make some references to some of the things that we talked about before, but I'll be sure to give full context. As I mentioned last time, and I'm going to try to do the same thing today, I've been interested in approaching familiar topics in American and African American history, but from a slightly different perspective, to add new information, different context, or to raise new questions about stories that we've heard about before. Next slide. We started last week with a conversation of antebellum slavery that is somewhat different from the typical story that we hear. The story that we told last time was not specifically about African Americans being involved and engaged in agricultural production. We weren't talking about rice plantations or cotton plantations or the like. Instead, we were talking about the crucial and central role that enslaved labor played in the production of ceramics and pottery, which was an incredibly important material, absolutely necessary for the operation and maintenance of the plantation system. And we talked a bit about some of the items that you see in front of you, but as I mentioned last time, if you held food in it or contained liquid in it, if you drank from it or ate from it, if you stored foodstuffs in it, all of that material was ceramics. And if you think about all of the kind of applications that food storage and liquid storage would have had on southern plantations, you can imagine how much ceramic material was necessary. And so in the South, and in particular, we talked about the region of Edgefield, South Carolina, potting area on the west side of the state. Particularly in Edgefield, the ceramics that are being produced there are being produced at an industrial scale. There's massive amounts of ceramics that are being produced in order to support the plantation system. And so in some ways, this is a story about American slavery that is familiar in a lot of ways, that is also a bit unfamiliar. It's a kind of production that we don't spend a lot of time talking about. Next slide. We spent a lot of time in that first session talking about the most famous and most well-known enslaved potter from the region, someone who we know as Dave. We know him as Dave because he signed his pots, that he was not only literate, but he was signing and dating his pots, that he was making these magisterial pieces of pottery, these huge pieces of pottery that were very much in demand. His pots were known far and wide. And in fact, slave owners were commissioning Dave pots, what were called Dave pots. He was signing and dating his pots, but he was also including rhyming couplets and poetry on the sides of his pots. I know that one question that came up during the first session, I want to address it now, was how did he come to learn to read and write at a time when it's not only illegal for enslaved people to know to read and write, but it's also illegal for whites to teach Black people how to read and write in the antebellum period. We don't have definitive answers on how he learned to write, but we do know that one of his owners was the owner and manager of a local newspaper, and that Dave likely spent a good deal of time in and around the typesetting rooms that were necessary to produce this paper. That goes some distance to explain how he might have learned to read, but it actually doesn't tell us much about how he learned to write. And one of the things we talked about before, and you can see certainly from this slide, is that Dave had a masterful hand. He wasn't just a writer; he was a writer who had a very particular style of penmanship, which in the 19th century would have been very important. Your handwriting was incredibly important. So that's where we ended. The conversation was with Dave, and with a kind of provocation that I promised from the last time. One of Dave's most famous rhyming couplets is, "I wonder where is all my relations, peace to all in every nation." It's one of the rhyming couplets that he inscribed on the side of one of his pots. And I promised that I would tell you more about his relations in this talk, and we should be able to get there before the end of the hour. Next slide, please. So today I want to talk again about a familiar story, but in a slightly unfamiliar context. That is the story of the transatlantic slave trade. And I want to talk a bit about the way that I first came to understand the transatlantic slave trade as a student, as a high school student myself, and how some of what we're learning about the transatlantic slave trade in the most recent research is really changing the way that we think about the trade, for which art is absolutely essential. Next slide, please. So this is one of the ways that I came to understand what the transatlantic slave trade was, that when it was presented to me in high school, the trade was almost always presented to me as an abstraction of charts or graphs or lines. And that material was almost always meant to communicate to me how many people got on boats and how many people got off boats. That the story of the transatlantic slave trade was, for me, really a story about numbers. It was presented to me as a story about numbers. And you have a great example of that here, where the story of the transatlantic slave trade is about charts and numbers, about people who got on boats and people who got off of boats. Next slide, please. When the trade wasn't presented as an aggregate of numbers, it would be abstracted in another way, often through arrows. And in this scenario, the principal lesson was still largely the same, to think about what got on boats, and sometimes people and sometimes products, but what was put on boats, and then where did those boats go, and what was taken off of the boats. These arrows were, I have to say, deeply frustrating to me as a student, because either in the arrows or in the charts, I wasn't getting any sense of what the transatlantic slave trade actually was, how it operated, who was involved. It was a massive, forced migration, largest forced migration in human history, and yet there were no people at all in the story that I was being told. And it was also frustrating to me, if I'm being not only honest but personal. It was also frustrating to me because the United States, and in particular the experiences of African Americans, kind of falls out of this story in some significant ways. You see on the picture that you see on the left, there are these arrows depicting the movement of Africans out of the African continent into the Americas. That big, thick arrow that you see going to Brazil is meant to indicate that the vast majority of people who were embarked on slave ships in West Africa were disembarked in Brazil. And as you go up the Caribbean, you see progressively fewer and smaller arrows until you get to the United States, and you see that it's kind of very thin arrow of people who are coming to the United States. It's hard to look at that graph and not think that the experience of American slavery is somehow less important or diminished, or not comparable to the experiences that other people had in other areas. And so I often found myself kind of frustrated by this representation for a number of reasons, not least of which, and I didn't find this out much later, but not least of which is that these maps and graphs often distort as much as they reveal. In the case of the map on the left, for example, while it is true that a relatively small number of people traveled directly from West Africa to the United States, what this map doesn't tell us is that when slave ships traveled through the Americas, they stopped first in Brazil, and then in the Caribbean, and then from the Caribbean to the United States. And so the thing that you don't see in this visual representation of the slave trade is the massive amount of trading that was happening between the Americas, up and down the Atlantic coast. And so if I had seen that map, I would have understood more the relationship that enslaved African Americans had with enslaved people from other parts of the Americas. But instead, I just got this really thin line, and I couldn't quite find myself or see myself in that thin line. Next slide, please. As it turns out, though, these abstractions of the transatlantic slave trade are rooted in the historical sources. We don't say this out loud or in an explicit way, but there actually is a relationship between those attempts to abstract the slave trade with what was actually happening in the historical sources that give us information about the trade. This is from James Stansfield. James Stansfield was a shipboard physician who was writing on the deck of the slave ship and describing his own experiences there. And he notes that no pen, no abilities can give more than a very faint resemblance of the horrid situation. One real view, 1 minute spent in the slave rooms in the Middle Passage would do more for the cause of humanity than the whole collective eloquence of the British Senate. This idea that there's something about the transatlantic slave trade that can't be explained, that words simply don't capture the actual experience, is something that is widespread in descriptions of the transatlantic slave trade. Now, again, in this case, you have a British physician who's simply on board and monitoring his situation and observing the Middle Passage from on top of the decks. And he's at a loss for words for how to describe what he sees. His experience is mirrored in the experiences of the people who experienced the trade, who were in the holds of the ship. Next slide, please. Here we have one example from Okasagroniasaw, who is an individual who was born in West Africa. He was taken through the Middle Passage and into the Americas. And he writes this fascinating line in which everything that he might say about the transatlantic slave trade is trapped in between these ellipses. I was seasick at first, but when I became more accustomed to the sea, it wore off. My master ship was bound for Barbados. Now, the interesting thing about Gronier-Saw's narrative is that it's full of details. He has detailed descriptions of West African life and the culture that he was from. There are detailed descriptions of his life in the Caribbean and what plantation slavery was like. There are plenty of details. He talks at length about his life and his experiences. It's a full memoir. But when he gets to the point of the Middle Passage, when he's talking about the transatlantic slave trade, the only thing that can hold that space are these ellipses. And in some ways, I don't think I'm overstating the point here. Maybe I am, but if I'm overstating it, I'm only exaggerating a point in order to make a point. In some ways, those ellipses have become the most popular 3 dots in African American life and letters, that there have been scholarly treatments of those ellipses in articles and book studies. And there's been an incredible amount of critical analysis that's been applied to those 3 dots, that despite the fact that he can say everything about everything else, Gronier-Saw can't say anything. He has no words for his experience in the Middle Passage. Next slide, please. We'll see another example of much the same. This is from Kwabena Kugwano. Again, someone who was born and spent their early life in West Africa, was captured as a part of the transatlantic slave trade and then brought to the Americas. Kugwano, when he gets to that point where it's time to describe his experience on the Middle Passage, he just says it would be needless, just needless to arrange a history of all the base treatment which the African slaves are subjected to. And I think that there's a really interesting phrase about halfway down this quote where he notes that the whole of the evil of the transatlantic slave trade, the whole of it, can easily appear in every part and at every view. He's suggesting that if you just look at one small piece of the transatlantic slave trade, all of what he calls the exceeding wickedness, all of the exceeding wickedness is evident at every single view and in every little detail. And so he refuses to go into detail about the larger experiences that he has. He doesn't personalize, he doesn't talk about it at all. He only notes that he's not going to talk about it. Next slide, please. And so what do you do with this gap? You have arrows and you have charts, you have historic sources that tell you that no pen can communicate, or these ellipses that are meant to kind of take up space and hold space, but don't give us direct details. In the case of Kugwano, there's an absolute refusal to try to describe the transatlantic slave trade. And so I think it's in that space, in those ellipses, that art becomes incredibly important. In some of the material that we're going to see in the next section of the talk is art for art's sake, that it's art meant to be artistic. We'll see some examples of that. But we'll also see some examples of visual imagery that was not necessarily initially intended to be taken as art, but has become art despite itself. Next slide, please. What you're looking at here is a depiction of the slave ship Brooks. This is a particular slave ship that was operating in the 1780s. And as abolition and the abolition movement gained increasing popularity, especially in England, the British Parliament started to investigate the nature of the transatlantic slave trade in an attempt to find out the degree to which the trade itself was or was not inhumane. And so the evidence that was presented to Parliament on behalf of these abolitionists was a plan of the slave ship Brooks. The very top of the image, you see a profile of the slave ship Brooks kind of drawn in outline. In the middle, you see an array of captive bodies. These are captive Africans who would have been laying down. So we're kind of looking from the top view of the ship. And the same is true for the image just below that. We're looking kind of from the top view through the ship onto an array of captive Africans who would have been laying side by side. And at the very bottom, you get a vertical view to get some sense of how space was operating, both on the left and the right side, how space was operating on the slave ship. And so Parliament was interested in what we can say about the human experience of the transatlantic slave trade through this plan of the slave ship Brooks, which was an actual slave ship that was sailing through and around the Atlantic. Next slide, please. The thing that Parliament was particularly interested in was just how many people can be humanitarily packed onto slave ships, and how much space is provided and afforded to people, and how many is too many. And so they, in order to do that, they start doing a range of kind of calculations in calculus, right? Let it be supposed that every man slave is allowed 6 feet by 1 feet 4 inches for room, every woman 5 feet 10, every boy 5'1", it goes down the list, every girl. It will follow that the annex plan of the slave vessel will be precisely the representation of the slave ship Brooks, and of the exact number of persons, neither more nor less, that could be stowed in the different rooms of it upon these data, if counted, will be found to amount to 451. And so reading the plan of the slave ship Brooks and then dividing that space, the Parliament finds that one can have no more than 451, that the maximum capacity of captive Africans on this ship is 451. What must have been their situation when 600 were stowed in them at the time, alluded to by Dr. Trotter, who belonged to the ship, and 609 by the Confession of the Slave Merchants and subsequent voyage. And so we know, for example, that on several occasions, the number of captive Africans who were placed on the ship exceeded 451 by a large number. And that 451, just to be clear, is the plan that you saw before, that the degree to which people are packed on that plan, the sum of the number of those people is 451. But we know that the ship was carrying in excess of 600 captives at several times. Next slide, please. Here are other examples of the same plan. This is much of what you've seen before. I'm just zooming in to give you a better sense of it. One of the things about the slave ship Brooks and about this particular plan is that it doesn't actually account for the human experience of the transatlantic slave trade. In some ways, the people who are figured here are not really people at all. They're merely placeholders, and they're all interchangeable one to another. You've simply marked them as a way of counting space. And in addition to this, none of the affective experiences of the Middle Passage can be reflected on this ship. None of what it sounded like, or what it actually looked like, what it smelled like, none of that is evident here. Even the bodies that are included here are not moving. They're all in the same orientation. They're not writhing in pain. So there's a way in which this ship sanitizes the actual lived experience of enslaved people or captive people on these ships. They're really meant here just to be placeholders and to count. Next slide, please. Here you see another example, to which is added some of more information about where both people and things would be held on the ship. So you see a cabin that's meant for women, one for boys, one for men. You see a storeroom on the side, an area where guns would be kept on the side. Now, I'll say one quick thing about the experiences of women in particular on board ships. Largely due to patriarchal and paternalist kind of ideas around the transatlantic slave trade, it was more often for women to have time on the deck of the ship, that they could have a little bit more mobility on the ship. Now, that mobility on deck of the ship also brought them under the constant surveillance of the crew, and women were subject to assaults while they were on deck. Now, I don't mean to suggest that the women were on deck the ship and the men are below. I don't mean to suggest that at all. But there were times when certain women would be drawn from the holds of the ship below and carried up to the top. This turns out to be one of the most important facets of shipborne rebellion. That is to say that it was women who could see the operations of the ship aboard deck when they would be brought up. They were able to witness and see when the time for rebellion or resistance was most apt. And they were often the communicators to the larger bodies of enslaved men, women, and children below deck to let them know that now is the time or now is not the time for shipborne rebellion. And so in some ways, this kind of quite frankly, sexist or paternalistic patriarchal attitude that some of the crew would have for enslaved women to bring them up or have access to them, that actually was one of the key features that made slave ship rebellions possible. Next slide, please. Here again is another portion of something that you've seen before, just to give you a close view of what we're looking at in terms of the slave ship Brooks. I should say, and I'll give you one example in just a moment, but this plan, the plan of the slave ship Brooks, emerged as the most widely reproduced image of any slave ship or any visual representation of the transatlantic slave trade. The plan of the slave ship Brooks was widely distributed, widely dispersed, not just in abolitionist circles, but it became, in many ways, just the most famous picture of the transatlantic slave trade, and emerged as the way that people understand the transatlantic slave trade. This was the image. This was the visual cue to what the slave trade looked like. Next slide, please. As that image of the slave ship Brooks became more widely produced and shared and disseminated, the abstraction started to increase as well, that more and more you start to see the captive Africans becoming less and less figured as people. And in this case, this is adapted, of course, from the slave ship Brooks. We're not looking at captives as much as we're simply looking at rectangles, that the Africans on board this ship have just been reduced now to clearly to counters, almost as if they're numbers themselves. Next slide, please. Again, you have this abstraction occurring, not just in the visual representation, of slavery and the slave ship, but you also find this this abstraction happening in linguistic and verbal descriptions of the slave trade. So again, you have John Newton. This is another member of a British slave ship crew who is talking about the transatlantic slave trade. And again, he's not quite able to describe the experience, the affective, emotional, sensory experience. And instead, as a kind of erudite, educated figure, the only analogy that he can draw is to books on a shelf. But even here, there's an attempt to abstract the real experience of the transatlantic slave trade to anything other than the actual lived experience on the ship. There's this difficulty that people have in describing the experience for what it is. Next slide, please. Interestingly, this image of the transatlantic slave trade, this plan of the slave ship Brooks, which is initially used, as I mentioned, as a kind of abolitionist tool to help describe the inhumanity of the trade, but at the cost of actually depicting real African captives. The power of the plan of the slave ship Brooks isn't in the pain and experiences of captive Africans, because all of that has been kind of sanitized from the image. Instead, the power of that image is in this ability of the plan and of the human figures that are depicted in the plan their ability to stand in for the large scale experiences of many people. They are in many ways placeholders. Placeholders not just for the people who experienced slavery on the slave ship Brooks itself, but also kind of placeholders for metaphors, really, for the transatlantic slave trade itself. So it's curious to me that although this visual imagery was never really meant to capture the Black experience in its totality or in its wholeness, nevertheless, this image has become incredibly important in visual representations of the transatlantic slave trade. What you're looking at on your right is just one piece of a magisterial visual essay that Tom Feelings produces about the transatlantic slave trade. He draws in this wonderfully evocative tone both the experiences of Africans on the African continent, in the experience of capture, and then he abstracts that across the Atlantic and into the New World. It's really a quite fantastic representation of the slave trade. I've included a link to that book because I find it to be a really helpful tool for helping people see both the importance of the slave ship Brooks. It does appear in Tom Feeling's work, but also to think through the humanity. And so in some ways, the human experience, the affective experience, the experience of human senses, that is often depicted through and by art, not necessarily through the historical sources that we have to describe that experience, because the historical sources in so many ways just fall short. They explicitly fall short. They tell us that they are already falling short in their attempts to describe. And so art becomes a way to talk to and through the actual human experience. Next slide, please. Here's another representation of the slave ship Brooks in a place that you might not expect to find it. This is the cover art for Bob Marley's Survival album, a fantastic album in which Bob Marley is making a case through the use of these flags. He's making a kind of Pan-Africanist case for the shared mutual experiences of Black people around the Atlantic Rim. And the image that is used to make that case for a kind of Pan-African identity is an abstraction, is the slave ship Brooks. Like that is in this visual vocabulary, in the visual vocabulary of this album cover, the slave ship Brooks is a metaphor for the thing that keeps us together, for a kind of Pan-African identity. So again, you find this art in places that you might not expect to find it. Next slide, please. Here again, you find the slave ship Brooks being abstracted, this time by Barry Unsworth in Sacred Hunger, which is a novel about the transatlantic slave trade. And that image then, again, comes to us. We've inherited this wildly popular image from the 18th and 19th century, and it's been appropriated in all sorts of ways to tell the story, to be a kind of shorthand for what the transatlantic slave trade is and does. Next slide, please. Another example from art. This is the work of Carol Walker. You see this image of the ship being held up by what are kind of disembodied Black hands. The hands extend out of the water, but they're not quite connected to arms or to a body underneath. You see, if you look really closely, you'll see the figure of an African woman who is a spirit of a sort. I think that part is really open to interpretation, but there's almost a sense that like the spirit of African people are just under the slave ship itself. You see that her hands are kind of extending back to her. They're cut off at the water's surface, and then these hands are emerging. So there's a sense here of kind of disconnection and detachment. On the shore to the left, you see in profile an image of what looks to be a slave owner or a slave trader in the hat. and a kind of stereotypical play on a stereotypical profile of an African figure who is holding a stalk of corn, a kind of visual imagery of the Americas. And so even for contemporary artists, the slave ship Brooks and the slave ship itself is still carrying a tremendous amount of explanatory power. Next slide, please. Although it may not be immediately apparent, this painting by J.M.W. Turner was scandalous in 1840 when it was presented. The reviews and reactions to this painting were vocal in their opposition to what they regarded as, and they used the term in the 19th century, I'll use the term now, it's not exactly a polite term, but they regarded this image as a kind of pornography. And they described it in that way. Many people had visceral reactions, like physical reactions to this visual representation of the slave trade and of slave ships. And part of what they were responding to were the bodies and parts of bodies that you see, if you look closely, in the water. There is, in a way that is absolutely scandalous for the 1840s, there is the naked leg of a woman to which is affixed a shackle around the ankle. And when people saw this image of this kind of chaotic violence on Atlantic waters, they responded in very definite ways. So there's a way in which the visual representation, again, this is from 1840, there is a way in which visual representations, artistic representations of the trade can come to stand in for everything that other kinds of sources, historical sources, and even the slave ship Brooks, like this artistic intervention can stand in for the sensory experience in a way that that other kinds of material and information can't. Next slide, please. So we know that the transatlantic slave trade was made illegal in 1859. I'm sorry, in 1808. We know that the transatlantic slave trade was made illegal in 1808. But we also know that the illicit trade continued throughout the 19th century. While we know a lot about the transatlantic slave trade, the legal transatlantic slave trade, we have a lot of data about the legal transatlantic slave trade, about ships and ships' captains and where they went and all of the material that we use to build those charts and arrows. We have that data. There's a scarcity of information about the illicit slave trade that happened from 1808 until, in this country, the eve of the Civil War. We don't have that data because the people who were engaged in the slave trade at that point were committing a criminal act. And so they weren't keen on keeping good records. And in fact, when you read ship's logs from that period, you'll often find kind of strange references to coffee or tar or other kind of references to Black products being traded. There's some indication that slave ship captains, after the period of the legal slave trade, were using this kind of coded language to describe what was happening during this period of the illicit trade. One of the latest ships, and in some ways one of the most popular ships, well-known ships, I should say, that came during the illicit slave trade was a ship called the Wanderer that landed on Jekyll Island in Georgia with about 400 captive Africans. About 200 of those captives found themselves quickly shipped up the Savannah River, and some of them found themselves enslaved in Edgefield, South Carolina, this area that was producing pottery at an industrial scale. Next slide, please. Here's a profile of the slave ship Wanderer. It was initially outfitted as a yacht. It was a very fast ship, which is why it was chosen to engage in this illegal trade. I should say just briefly that there was a call during this time in the very late stages of the antebellum period. There were increasing Southern voices who were calling for the reopening of the transatlantic slave trade on grounds that the wealthy planters had enriched themselves by trading in African slaves. And then once the slave trade became illegal, that the value of those captives increased significantly, and that middling or poor whites weren't able to get into the game because the trade was illegal. And so there was a lot of push to reopen the transatlantic slave trade and a certain amount of what we would have to call piracy. Next slide, please. Again, as it happens, a certain number of people, some of the people who traveled on the Wanderer, found themselves enslaved in and around Edgefield, South Carolina, where they worked on area potteries. Some of the survivors of the slave ship Wanderer were still working on area potteries after the Civil War into the late 19th and early 20th century. After the war, they're now working on these ceramic production sites as wage earners. And in 1908, a number of anthropologists and ethnographers traveled to Edgefield, South Carolina, for which we have these images. These images were taken in 1908. So these are people who were brought illegally into the country just before the Civil War. They were engaged in work first as slaves and then later as wage workers on some of these area potteries. Their photos were taken in 1908. They're still living in and around the area. And one of the things that's most fascinating to me is that the anthropologists preserved not just their American or English names, but also preserved their African names. Next slide, please. Here are more survivors of the Wanderer slave ship. And next slide, please. One of the things that anthropologists were interested in doing with this material was thinking about the degree to which or how much African culture, aspects of African culture, survived the Atlantic Passage, especially in the case of the Wanderer, with this very recent arrival of captive Africans. To what extent did aspects of African culture seep into African American culture after 1859 and become a part of the local Black culture in and around Edgefield, South Carolina, and neighboring areas? And so one of the things that they followed was the emergence of a vast vocabulary. I'm only giving one page of the vocabulary that they built. It goes on actually for quite several pages, for many pages, of local African American syntax, grammar, and vocabulary that was rooted in this experience of the recent Wanderer arrivals. One of the important things about this vocabulary that you see here is that linguists have been able to track these particular words and word usages back to very specific spaces in West Central Africa. So we know with great specificity, with pretty good specificity, where the Wanderer captives were from in West Central Africa, in current day Kongo. And we know something of their life, and the life that they had before, based solely on close inspection and consideration of this vocabulary. We placed in the chat the reference for the article that I'm citing right now, but I have to warn you. I am deeply, deeply grateful that the anthropologists and ethnographers who went to Edgefield to interview and research this material, I'm deeply grateful that they photographed some of the survivors of the Wanderer. That's a document that we'll have forever. I'm deeply grateful that they recorded both the American as well as the African names of the subjects that they were interested in. I find this vocabulary incredibly useful. That's all to the good. But I must say, I have to warn you that when you read the rest of the article, it's written in the early 20th century. It is riddled with the kind of colonial and imperial, and to be quite frank, just explicitly plain racist considerations that you might expect in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. And so when you read this, this is not, for example, an article that I assign to students, because you really have to read between the lines of perspectives and understandings of African culture and African people are deeply, deeply debilitated because it's through this racist lens. And yet, through that same lens, we get access to these photographs and these names and this vocabulary, which is invaluable. And so I encourage you to go to this original source, but I also just have to tell you that when you see what I'm talking about, just know that I know and that I've warned you. Next slide, please. So I want to talk a little bit about what's in store for the third and last installment of this series, which I feel like we've gotten here really, really quickly. Maybe it's gone by too fast. I've really enjoyed this. The thing that I want to focus on for the next time is to think really seriously and closely about how we can use objects to tell historical stories, and how objects and items can help us through oftentimes some of the documentary gaps that we have in telling the story of history. In particular, the survivors of the Wanderer will find themselves enslaved on these pottery area in the pottery regions of Edgefield, South Carolina, and neighboring areas. Shortly after their arrival, there emerges this explosion of a very particular and distinct type of art production. You're seeing some examples of it there. You may be familiar with face vessels. You may have come across face vessels in one context or another. And so one of the things that we'll be doing for the next time is to think about how the Wanderer survivors, coming from a very particular cultural context in West Central Africa, and we know with quite a bit of detail what environment they were coming from, how they came across the Americas, across the Atlantic, and into the Americas, onto this area, and started to articulate their own artistic and aesthetic senses in a totally different environment and in completely different material. The material that they would have used in West Central Africa would not have been this kind of ceramic clay exactly, but the language and the meaning and the aesthetic power and ritual power of some of these objects is very much in line with what they would have had in their African context. And so what we'll talk about a bit next time is to think about, through objects, how does African culture and aesthetics and philosophy and thought come to play an incredibly important role in the emergence of African American artistic creativity and constructions on the other side of the Atlantic. So that's a tease for next time, but I'm more than happy. I think we may have a couple of moments. If there are any questions on the floor, I'm happy to take them.
We do, Dr. Young. Thanks so much. Let me queue up the questions coming in. And I want to thank you, because one question that teachers are often thinking about is resource spaces. When presenting history, we want unimpeachable, factual, resource-based materials for students, but at the same time, thinking about the context of which we're giving and providing to students, right? We don't want to harm them or create a feeling, right, that they're not going to engage with the history. So I really appreciate that. And that's kind of where the question that I'm going to share with you is coming from. And I love that you used the language, the scandalous imagery of Turner's painting. I thought that was fantastic use of that in context. Like, I could see how teachers could use this type of conversation with the time period, right? To discuss the culture of the time. But within a lot of the art that you shared and pieces presented, was there any type of socio-political response to those pieces, such as Turner's painting? And was there any type of impact that attempted to like reverse this stuff that was happening that may not have been so palatable and clearly today, but maybe even then? Is there any type of response for that?
Yeah, you mean in terms of visual material or just generally?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, when we look at Turner's painting, for example, as one particular piece, did that actually cause any type of major socio-political response?
Yeah, I
just
think
taking that piece.
Yeah, I think that's actually really important. And so I'll say a couple of things. The first is that the abolitionist movement was first targeted and directed at the slave trade itself. Even before they called for an end to slavery itself, it was the slave trade itself that was seen as particularly inhumane. And so I think I mentioned that we have reports of people when they saw this image, they had a visceral response. And so it did have a very real significant impact in how people came to understand the transatlantic slave trade. As long as the trade was this thing that happened over there, far away from us, it was easy for people in the metropole, whether that's London or Liverpool or Paris or what have you, they could maintain a kind of objective distance. But once these images start to circulate, it forces people to make a decision. They either have to acknowledge the inhumanity of these scenes and act upon it, or something else. And as it happens, the abolitionist sentiment started to increase tremendously once these images started to get into circulation.
When we say that we have these enslaved individuals coming in, and this is another question coming from our audience, and actually directly connects with content expectations that our educators have to share and work with our students around it to learn in learning. And that is, can you help us understand and have a better understanding around the description of how enslaved individuals were able to retain their cultural elements, even with everything happening to them?
It is a most remarkable human accomplishment. I don't think that, and I'm not talking about present company excluded. Generally speaking, I don't think we have a sense of just how wide and diverse the African continent is. It is a huge landmass covering thousands and thousands of miles, thousands of dialects, all kinds of different religious expressions and ritual practices. It is an incredibly diverse, big space. It is absolutely remarkable to me that people in all of that diversity, starting with their experience in the transatlantic slave trade, started to manage and manufacture and maintain ideas of commonality, common languages, common religious and spiritual practices. It is an incredible feat. And I think that the best way that I use to describe this is to imagine that the things that the largest number of people held in common, those issues of moments of kind of commonality, tended to be the things that became African American culture, and the things that were most distinct or kind of most outlying in one culture or another probably fell off. And so what you have in the Americas, and I'm not just talking about the United States, but throughout the Caribbean and into South America, what you have is something of the kind of combined soup of African culture, language, and religion, and some part of that gets encapsulated as the Black cultures of the Americas.
Yeah, and we have another connector with Dave and just how important Dave is. And maybe I can ask you to expand on that, being that he was so prevalent in the work that ended up being preserved over this amount of time. Yeah, and so maybe you can expand just a little more on our friend Dave.
Yeah, I think it's really important to note that much of this material was widely disregarded. Like people did after the period of slavery. Once ceramics get replaced by glass, and then later on as kind of plastics and other forms, much of this material gets disregarded. People aren't paying a lot of attention to it. And for much of the 20th century, this material is ignored. Partly ignored because it was considered crude or what have you. This material is now being traded on an increasingly lucrative art market, it enters into the realm of high art. Depends on how you count, but it starts to enter into the realm of high art and starting in the 1960s and 70s. And in the last 10 to 12 years, it has become an incredibly desired material and object. It's an interesting function of ceramics is that this stuff will be here after we're all gone. And at the same time, it's really fragile. It carries both of those qualities. It's an incredibly durable material, but it's also incredibly fragile. And so now that the material has its value, its actual monetary value has increased, it will be with us for a long time now. And Dave was really at the center of making this material, both as a master crafter, but also as a poet.
Yeah, I can't thank you enough, Dr. Young, for sharing and modeling a way of which our social studies educators and our other educators who have joined us can bring in art to really share and show true history that's happened. And in many cases, we can see that history showing up in modern day examples like Marley's covers, right? And,
that's right, yeah.
Yeah, so thank you so much, Dr. Young.
More than happy. I'm looking forward to the next one.
So as we move forward here, friends, thank you for joining us. I would like to thank Dr. Young again for sharing his knowledge with us throughout this webinar. Your work is important to Michigan's educators and leaders as it truly supports how we teach comprehensive history within our classrooms. We sincerely appreciate you creating this presentation in support of this important Michigan Department of Education effort. Thank you to the Teaching Comprehensive History team for their work moving the Teaching Comprehensive History webinar series forward. I thank you attendees for listening and learning with our team throughout this season's webinars, and we'll continue. So Dr. Rice would like to remind us that as members of a diverse state, nation, and world, school staff and students need to know our rich, complex history. These powerful webinars, along with the provided resources, encourage Michigan educators and school leaders to deepen their knowledge so they may share with their students. As searing as some of our history is, we have a responsibility to teach it all. Please be sure to register for the next two webinars in this series with Dr. Young. The sessions will be Wednesday, well, this is the second, but the next series will be Tuesday, March 26th for both session, or for the session will be 4 to 5 o'clock as a reminder. Thanks for sticking with me as I mumbled through that. So catch us next Tuesday on the 26th. We do encourage attendees and educators to visit the Teaching Comprehensive History website to revisit past webinars and gain access to incredible resources and for future registration opportunities. Again, thank you all for joining us today. Please make sure to complete the survey for this event that will be emailed to you when you close out of the webinar and when the webinar has been closed out officially. Have a great rest of your day.